We'd like to begin by acknowledging that Royal Roads University rests upon the traditional lands of the Concepcion and Lekwungen families. There has been a long history of teaching and learning and gathering on these lands, and we are so grateful to be able to live, learn, and work on these traditional lands of the Concepcion and Lekwungen ancestors and families. So my name is Selena Kunar, and I am so excited to be here with our scholar practitioners to explore systems thinking and strategic enrollment management. So we are so fortunate to have Dr. Tamara Leary, Director of our School of Education and Technology, as well as Program Head of our Graduate Certificate in Strategic Enrollment Management, as well as Dr. Clayton Smith, who's an Associate Faculty within our School of Education and Technology, as well as an Associate Professor at the University of Windsor, and Director of the AACRAO Strategic Enrollment Management Conference. So we are in very good hands to explore systems thinking and strategic enrollment management. So with that, I will pass it over to you, Tamara, and we'll get started.
Thank you, Selena, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Just to give you a little bit of context for our presentation prepared for you today, Dr. Smith and I have had the opportunity to work together and design a graduate certificate for strategic enrollment management, which we'll talk a little bit about at the very end of this presentation. But we've received a lot of interest in the program, and we thought it might be helpful to share with you the method of our madness, I guess, in how we put the courses together and why. What is it about systems thinking that applies to strategic enrollment management? What is it about strategic enrollment management that can serve as a good example of systems thinking? So we're going to just spend a little bit of time today talking about systems thinking and about its application or approach within strategic enrollment management. We'll kick off by asking, and you can just use your chat box there, when you hear the term systems thinking, what do you believe systems thinking to be? What do you understand it to be? And maybe if a couple folks just get the conversation started in the chat box, that would be great. Thank you, Joanne, for kicking it off. How your changes impact systems through the educational institution. Absolutely, that is indeed a part of systems thinking. When we're talking about systems thinking, we're referring to understanding the full system, the complexity of any system. Next slide, Selena, and the rest of you can just keep popping definitions in there if you would like. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work of Peter Sangay, the fifth discipline. He certainly is the author, I guess, or the creator, if you will, of this whole idea of systems thinking and identifying it as a specific discipline required for an organization to effectively function and evolve, to be a learning organization. He specifically, next slide, Selena. I forget that I'm not in control of the slides. So he defines a learning organization as one that offers opportunities for people to create, for people to learn from and achieve desired results, an organization that offers an environment that nurtures new ways of thinking, a workplace that fosters collective aspiration, and one that encourages shared learning. One of the things that people often perceive or assume is when they read about systems thinking and the reference to a learning organization, they think that it's explicit to universities, colleges, or education type learning organizations, and that is actually not the case. Quite often, higher education or education facilities lend themselves perhaps a little bit more naturally to this way of thinking, but it is not exclusive to higher education or to the education sector. We're talking about any organization and the environment that they create that is conducive to the things that are mentioned. Understanding the connections, thank you, Kara, and having that ability to understand the interdependence between the different stakeholders, the different partners in that organization is critical. Next slide, Selena. We have a whole course, both in the graduate certificate for SEM and within the Mahil program, that's dedicated to systems thinking. So there's no way we're going to be able to cover all of that content in our time here today. We wanted to just give you that brief overview. There are 5 disciplines that Sangay refers to in terms of having a learning organization: personal mastery, shared vision, team learning, mental models, and the 5th that he added was systems thinking. When we talk about personal mastery, what we're talking about is an organization that recognizes the value, that fosters, that encourages, that invites team members to truly dream, create goals, to be actively engaged in their work, to be able to identify what it is that they bring to their position, to that organization, the value of that contribution, and to be able to ensure that people have what they need to achieve those goals. And this is something that is constant. So it's you're evolving as an active member within your organization. There's a safety to be able to take informed risks, if you will. And there's a shared vision, which is the next discipline. So together with your teams, a learning organization that's operating effectively ensures that there is a collective vision, that people have a vested interest in the organization's success because they've also been engaged in identifying what that success is. It evolves, it adapts. Look at how many organizations have had to pivot with what we're dealing with now in a pandemic. And a learning organization would ensure that people are part of that conversation, that they've had opportunity to contribute their ideas, to be able to realign their goals, to better understand exactly how this has impacted their specific role within that organization, so that together as a team, there is that joint sense of responsibility, accomplishment, and celebration and growth. So that leads into what the 3rd discipline of team learning. So what's meant by this, it's implied that a learning organization is one that ensures the team has an opportunity to learn together and to learn from one another, which obviously, like I said, the name alone seems to infer that. But something that's not inferred in that name that's very, very important and is a critical component of an organization that is truly approaching, or truly implementing a systems thinking approach, is that the teams or part of the culture of the institution or the organization is one that stops to reflect, that learns from past experiences. I mentioned that there is a safety to take, well-informed risks. These risks that they provide learning opportunities. So instead of a sense of fear or failure that can quite often, foster a sense of failure or feeling defeated, an effective learning organization will ensure that there is safety among the teams, among the organization, that allows you to learn from those mistakes. That there is a collective kind of aha moment, if you will. There is support, there are resources for figuring out, okay, we tried this, it didn't work the way that we felt it would. What went wrong? How can we improve? Again, it's that sense of collectivity. It's not finger pointing, it's a shared sense of responsibility. in terms of understanding sometimes, why aren't some of our processes working? What is going wrong? How is it that we keep ending up in this position when we know that we have plans that say that we're going to do a better job, we're going to do something different, yet we're ending up with facing some of the same challenges? The fourth discipline, mental models, refers to, within a learning organization, taking the time to truly understand what are some of the barriers that exist and what are some of the perceived barriers. What are some of the assumptions being made by your team members that may be informed only, or that are not informed on evidence. They're not evidence-based, if you will. They could be handed, just almost mythical, in the sense that it's evolved with the growth of the organization, but there's no real truth to it. And if there's a negative connotation to that, if there is a shared sense of failure with something, ideas can be blocked before they're even given a fair chance to take off because of those mental models. It's a sense of, that's not going to work because of this, or we're not going to try that because of that, or there's no way that's going to work because the last time we tried it, this is what happened. So it's very, very important, again, around that, in that belief that as an organization, all of your team members have a vested interest in the success and an identity within that success and within that organization. We have to make sure that we're understanding what potential barriers truly do exist, or may just exist because of people's assumptions, or frustrations or bias. It's very, very important to understand that. So looking at all of those four disciplines, the framework, or the conceptual framework of systems thinking, was introduced. And with systems thinking, it's considering all of those other four disciplines and taking a holistic approach in terms of understanding the relationships between different stakeholders and how those relationships are interdependent. So when we think about higher education, for example, when you start thinking or applying a systems thinking framework, you're looking at your processes, your decision-making processes, your operations, your planning, not solely from the perspective of your unit. So if you're working in finance, let's say, you're not going to decide to change a policy or a practice without truly first consulting and understanding what the implications of that change may be for other points of operation in your institution. So it's the recognition that nothing really happens in a vacuum, that because of the complexity, because of the interdependence, we have to stop and we have to have due process. We have to ensure that there are conversations and consultation to understand how what we're doing in one part of the institution may have ripple effects that we weren't aware of. That may be negative, they may be positive, but they may be negative too. And we need to know what that is, what those are. It's very important too, to clarify that this doesn't mean everything will be, rainbows and butterflies, so to speak. That systems thinking, is certainly realistic enough to know that not everybody's going to be in full agreement all the time. But having the awareness, having an understanding of what it is that will be impacted as one unit makes a decision or makes changes in practices, or what the impact of a strategic change of in the direction of the institution may be on any given unit of the institution. These are things that are given thought to, and are prepared for, and have I've had conversations and a degree of assessment, risk assessment, identifying what investments need to be made to set things up for success. So it's that holistic. It's more than just knowing who is affected. It's more than just simply, agreeing that everybody's going to be on side. It goes deeper and truly understands the interdependence of those relationships. Next slide, Selena. So this is one of my favorite illustrations, I guess, pictures that I associate with systems thinking. So in this, you can see that really and truly, the folks at the top end of that boat would be very misinformed to think that somehow the hole at the bottom of the boat wasn't going to, at some point in time affect them. And this is what, when we think about something happening in our own institution and you think, oh, it's, that doesn't affect me, or I can change this. I don't really have to give any thought to how that's going to impact other units. We could actually be setting ourselves up for a situation similar to this picture. So key components of a systems thinking approach are listed there, and I've referred to some of them. You have an understanding of who your key stakeholders are, both internal to your organization and external. You have an understanding of what each of those stakeholder roles are. What are their responsibilities? What are their expectations? What are their contributions to any process, to the overall operations of the institution? It also ensures that there's a collective understanding of those relationships. They're very complex and they're often multi-layered. So it's, all fine and dandy for finance and student affairs to get together and, say, yeah, we understand what's happening with one another and how we're working together, how our processes underlap. But within each of those units, then there are other relationships to understand. There are, there are a number of touch points for any process within a finance department. When you look at student affairs, there are multiple service providers and they interact. They have relationships that as a unit, student affairs needs to understand. Another key component of systems thinking is that it is evidence-based decision making, and this is probably one of the most applicable pieces when we get to talking about SEM. What are you basing your decisions on? How informed are your recommendations? How are you learning if you have made a step in the right direction? What are your assessment points? These are critical components of effectively thinking systemically in ensuring that you're going forward based on evidence, not based on assumptions, and you're holding yourselves accountable as an institution for that. There's never a shortage of data in any institution. Quite often when you sit around and you start to collectively think of making changes, or what do we need to do to respond to this or that, quite often a response is, well, we need the data. And let me assure you, more often than not, institutions are submerged in data. One of the challenges is we quite often don't know what data we have across the whole institution, and sometimes we don't really know how to effectively use that data. We don't know sometimes how to share that, how to really get the most out of that data. So it's important that we, in terms of taking a systems thinking approach, that we stop and make sure that we have that data, that it is informing our decisions, and that we have the right data, that we're asking the right questions of our data, that we're collecting the right data. Another component of systems thinking that I refer to is having a culture, having a work environment that is safe to learn from your experiences. That, when we make mistakes, when we try things that aren't successful, we don't just leave them. We go one step further. We seek to understand what was it that didn't, what did we not anticipate? What did not work well? Where did we come up short? And how do we learn from that so that that experience can serve as part of our evidence in making well-informed decisions? And a key component of systems thinking is that collective will, as I talked about earlier when we were looking at the disciplines, that whole concept, that whole approach of having a team environment and being there as a team for both the good and the bad. It doesn't, like I said, it's not always rainbows and butterflies. We know that there are difficult times. We all go through turbulent times. Obviously, we could spend, I'm sure, the next few hours talking about what we've all endured as a result of the pandemic and how our institutions have responded to that. A systems thinking approach, an effective learning organization will ensure that there is a collective will to make sure that we can revise, we can achieve, and we can assess those goals and go at it again. It's cyclical that way. Next slide, please. So there's nothing superficial about it. Sometimes it sounds simplistic. Yeah, you know, we get along. I know who's working in my organization. I've invited the right people to the table to have a conversation, and these are all good things. But don't be fooled. Systems thinking is not easy. It requires a great deal of investment. Sometimes it can require very difficult conversations, and you know, playing the long game, if you will, getting through those difficult times as you work toward collective goals. It's about in-depth working relationships. We know that those take investment. In order for them to be real, they stand the test of time through thick and thin. Again, understanding what works and why, and what doesn't work and why. And having that holistic approach, recognizing that institutions are constantly evolving, that they're dynamic, that there's no one set goal necessarily. We constantly have to adapt. We constantly have to pivot. We're influenced by so many external variables, things that are well beyond our control, things that we don't even anticipate that we find ourselves having to respond to. So it's that complexity, I think sometimes, that makes higher education what it is. And I would argue makes a systems thinking approach that much more valuable, having that intentional investment by all parties. You know, it truly, an effective learning organization, a learning organization that is healthy, is one that has the 5 disciplines that we've referred to kind of embedded in the varied culture and the DNA of that organization. It's not something that you can take from another organization. There's no cookie cutter approach to it. While there may be similarities, it is something that would be unique to your institution. So now we're going to talk a little bit more in terms of strategic enrollment management, how that can serve as an example where a systems thinking approach can really be beneficial.
Thank you, Dr. Leary. You know, I find this kind of an interesting space to be in. You're talking about rainbows and butterflies, and you show this graphic of a hole in the boat, and then you turn it over to me. You know, I think that's a little bit how some professionals feel these days. So what I'm going to do in the little bit of time I have is just introduce the whole idea of SEM, or Strategic Enrollment Management, within the whole context of this thing called systems thinking. And Dr. Leary doesn't know this, but I already borrowed one of her slides for one of my courses. So it's good stuff. It's good stuff. So here we have it. We have, and by the way, do you like my background? This is the first time I've gotten to use a Royal Roads background. This is kind of cool. So thanks to Selena for providing that to me. I feel dressed up now. That's good. That's good. So SEM and systems thinking, a little bit like this. Here's a couple of definitions for you. Mike Dolan's back in 1993, and you need to know that I wrote my dissertation about that time. So Mike and I did some stuff together, and so I'm kind of keep his definition going here. And he talks about it as a comprehensive process. I have to admit the fact I'm a dual citizen, so I speak American sometimes, so bear with me. But within the context of an academic or an instructional institution. And that's very, very important because SEM in its early days was all about things outside the academic context. It was about admissions and financial aid and orientation. And I'll tell you in a minute how that's changed. And the second definition here is from my friend Christine Curlin, who does a number of things with me. And she describes it with these words, comprehensive and coordinated. So she adds the word coordinated here, which is important. And she also adds the word integration, which is also really important. And I'll show you how that plays out as we go forward. But as you can see, she's given you a sort of a menu of where SEM focuses. And certainly it's going to focus on strategic plan, the environment, and variety of student and administrative services for sure. But as an academic these days, I can tell you it's also about what happens in and around the classroom. If we can go to the next slide, Selena. So here are the purposes. This comes from a former colleague, Bob Bontrager, and so words like data-rich environment, you heard Dr. Leary referred to evidence-based decision-making, how that important is. SEM starts, lives, breathes, benefits from good data analysis. But you also see words here now like support strategic dexterity and the identification of scenarios, which I'll show you how that fits in a minute here. But really, I added those words because we're in a pandemic. We have got to have dexterity, and we've got to be thinking about scenarios, not some sort of 5-year plan that's linear based and step 1, step 2, step 3, but we have got to be able to adapt, and SEM is doing that too. Clear goals is the second part of this. We have to know where we're going. And we have to get people to agree that that's where we're going. And that's part of what the SEM process is about, is trying to identify a direction, not a big vision direction, but an actual direction you can sink your teeth into. And again, options and scenarios is what we added here with regard to the last several months. Promoting students' academic success. Absolutely critical. I said to you a minute ago, we started with this whole idea of all the things at the front door. And I know some of you represent those things. But what we need to start thinking, no matter where you sit in the institution, that the key to SEM is the student experience, is we have got to find ways to ensure that the students get what they came here for, they stay long enough to get it, and then on their way out, they have something valuable that they then continue to spread the gospel as to how wonderful the academic experience is at a given institution. Academic program planning, absolutely. Even when faculty are designing what programs to do, when administrators are deciding which ones to endorse, with this whole idea of what to bring forward, it has to be based on SEM-like things. It also has to be about efficiency. Some of you represent student service offices or enrollment services offices, and it's got to be about getting the job done and getting it done well. And then lastly on this list is the idea of communication and collaboration. In my own dissertation many years ago, this is what I found to be the whole secret of SEM. And that is, it's the way we talk to each other and the way we collaborate between each other up and down and all around the institution is the absolute key to getting this job done. Next slide, Selena. So here's a little bit of a graphic. It's not a perfect graphic, but it is something to kind of get us started. It's the fundamental premise of SEM is this whole idea of the student experience. And so you see some things on the left there, recruitment, marketing, admissions orientation, maybe financial aid. Some things in the middle, you see, classroom experience, academic support, co-curricular, and then lastly, retention and degree goal attainment and so forth. In reality, these arrows should all be pointing at each other because there's nothing that goes on that doesn't impact everyone. So if we don't do the student experience well, recruitment gets hard. If we don't do recruitment well, the ability for faculty to do what they need to do in the classroom is challenged. So we just need to start thinking about all of these things and move out of the idea of SEM as something that happens, a bunch of administrative stuff that happens before students get here, to being a framework for thinking about how we get students to and support them as they go through the student experience. And the next slide. So key stakeholders, there are like lots of key stakeholders, and Dr. Leary introduced the whole idea of working with stakeholders, but who are they? They are people like staff in your various offices. They are faculty teaching your classes. They are student affairs professionals working in the residence halls and across the campus. They are parents. They're community members. They're school counselors. They're high school teachers. All of these are stakeholders in SEM. And so we have to think about how do we connect to them and how do we support what they're doing so that our goals can be achieved where we are. Next slide. So here's the Sem Planning Framework. Christine Curlin and I put this together a while ago. It's not entirely ours. It's been around for a little while, but we modified it a little bit. So one of the things you can see here is at the very bottom of this triangle is data collection analysis is huge, okay? And you can't get to the goals until you go through this phase. But similarly, you can't get to the data collection analysis phase until you take a look at the strategic plan. Because all this stuff needs to connect. And you go all the way up through and you can see how eventually it all connects to sustainable enrollment. On the left-hand side, what we see is this idea of strategic dexterity and multiple scenarios as the pathway to going up the SEM planning framework. Very important. And we need to have that agility in order to make it all the way through. Next slide. And came up with this little kind of graphic as we were doing the SEM Institute at the Acro SEM conference this year. And it's called Link, Integrate, and Extend. So let me just introduce this to you. Very simple to understand. Link, we need to link to all of those stakeholders we talked about just a minute ago. Inside the institution, outside the institution, different silos, different departments, all that kind of stuff. We need to link. We then need to integrate the things that we do with the things that others do. There shouldn't be this idea that I work in the registrar's office and you work over in student awards. This isn't actually real. And if you ask a student, they have just no idea of this kind of thing, okay? And so we have to integrate the things that we do so that we can actually reach the goals that we're talking about. And then through that linking and integration, we will extend our ability to get our enrollment goals reached. So think about that. Link, integrate, and extend. Next slide. So here's some critical questions, just some things to think about. And if we were in class today, these are some of the things I would ask you to think about. The first one is, what are your institutional goals or intentions for SEM? Do you know what they are? Do you know where to find them? Are you contributing to their development or their change or their adaptation? The second question here is, what is informing your approach? Are you just making this stuff up? And there are a lot of places that do, okay? But no, in SEM, we want to start with the data. Data that's inside the institution, data that's outside the institution. We want to become scholars of our own place. And in doing that, we'll need to have a real good handle on the data. And there's nothing better than when you go to some Dean's Council meeting or a Senate discussion and you've got the data and you can project it in simple ways so that people can understand it, but you understand the data. Who are your students? Do you know that? And I don't just mean the students who you like. I mean the students who you don't like, okay? As a former dean of students, I can tell you there were many days I had a little bit of both, okay? And I think you got to know them and you've got to love them. There's an old adage in SEM, it goes something like this. If you take care of the students you get the students that you want. And that's hugely important, and it's an absolute key to how we do our work. And then lastly here, are the right stakeholders represented and engaged in SEM? Very important. Don't leave the faculty on the side. Don't leave the senior administrators at home, because you can't do it without them. Don't forget about the players up and down and around the institution who make it all happen. So be thinking about how to engage them at the right point along the way, not to overwhelm them and not to take them over, but to have them feel like they're included in this thing. Next slide. Is the SEM plan aligned with the institution's vision, mission, and goals? Hugely important. Again, SEM is not this thing over here or over there. It's actually right in the middle of the institution. And it lives off of these things. If you don't know your vision, your mission, and your goals, you can't really do SEM. You need to have them. And some people say, well, should we develop the strategic plan before we do the SEM plan? I said, well, it doesn't actually matter. They can actually intermingle all the way up through, but they have to have a connection. And then the secondary here, is there an accurate understanding of the student enrollment cycle? So many times, my colleagues in the faculty will often tell me that, well, I just take them as they come. Let registrar do what it needs to do, and I'll take them into my class. And similarly, have the registrar's people over here not having a real idea as maybe what some of the challenges that faculty are faced with and some of the things that they need to do. Okay, that's important. And so we need to help people understand the whole student life cycle, from our first inquiry all the way up to them becoming alumni and giving back to the institution. And the next one. So how is SEM relevant? Well, this is a slide that was created because I felt that there was a disruption going on. We have this thing called a pandemic. And interestingly, here in Ontario, before we had a pandemic, we had a strike in all the schools, and that just created a disruption. So students in my faculty of education, as an example, have had to experience all of that. And so they're arriving here just a little not sure of themselves. And so we need to think about these things, the dislocation of students and the structures, the finances, the technologies, the whole notion of social justice and Black Lives Matters and Indigenous women, and all of these things are huge. And this disruption is real. The data I saw as early as this morning says first-year student enrollment is down. If I go across into the US, I'll find that international student enrollment is down massively. If I could go elsewhere and I could find that we are going to be challenged in the enrollment world. But the good thing about that, I like to say, it's job security. It's going to give us the ability to really help our institutions turn this thing around. So the creativity, the adapting, the seeing those scenarios, bringing your energy to the table and your love for your students and your place will make all of this extremely relevant. And the next slide. So here are the SEM tools for a changeful era. Here's some of them: mission and identity and planning and comprehensiveness, lines of communication, data tools, assessment, intentionality, adaptability, experience. These are some of them. They're not all of them, but in your toolbox, and as you go through this graduate certificate, we'll talk about these things. We'll make sure that you come out with these tools and many others so that you'll be ready to be a leader on your campus in SEM and supporting the student experience more generally. Go ahead. Slide. Oh, over to Dr. Leary.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. So, that certainly gives you a Reader's Digest version, perhaps, of systems thinking, strategic enrollment management, and the connection between the two. The graduate certificate in strategic enrollment management expands on that quite a bit. The intent being that graduates of the certificate program would have that skill set, that knowledge, to help their institution continue to move forward effectively and strategically when they're thinking about enrollment management. So your first course is the HEAL 550, which is Systems Thinking and Strategic Planning in Higher Education. So what I just very much sprinkled here today would be talked about in much greater depth. We spend a fair bit of time, obviously, in understanding what systems thinking is as a framework. We also dive into the methodology in terms of understanding those relationships, something that's referred to as feedback loops, and there's variations galore of how do you understand the cause and effect of the different relationships within an organization. And then from that helps give you that framework, that set of tools, that perspective of understanding the system as a whole and what's required in doing that, and applying that then as you go into 580 and work with Dr. Smith on enrollment management theory and practice. So again, there is always a place for theory, right? It's what informs what we do. And so you'll spend some time looking at the types of theories that inform enrollment management. How do you use those effectively? How do you implement those theories? How do they inform your practice, if you will, and your approach to enrollment management? 585 then, as your last capstone, gives you the opportunity to truly apply what you've learned in the program in the development of a strategic enrollment management plan. So the entire program is 6 months in length, 3 courses offered consecutively. You have about a 5-6 day break between each of the courses. Each course is 9 weeks, delivered online. Certainly you have synchronous sessions where you're all together, and you have asynchronous where you're working independently, offline, so to speak. An opportunity to work with one another. There are always team assignments. You can expect probably 3 individual assignments and 2 team assignments, thereabouts, for each of the courses. They fly by, 9 weeks, there's really nothing to that, which is why we have the requirement that we do around students having working knowledge experience in higher education in order to be admitted into the program. And the reason being, or education as a whole, the reason being there's a lot to learn. So you do have to hit the ground running, if you will, with having some context. You can put strategic enrollment management into a context, if you will. Selena, I'll hand it back to you for the logistics in terms of the start dates.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Tamara. So yes, I'll draw our attention to the chat box real quick. We have Lisa Murray, who's one of our wonderful enrollment advisors here at Rural Roads, who's popped some helpful links as Tamara went along and shared about the courses and the program itself. So if you have a moment to click around, please do. And if you have any questions about the program itself after doing some digging in those links, or as we continue in our conversation today, we're all more than happy to help answer those questions and continue the conversation. And speaking of continuing the conversation, we have some upcoming start dates for this program here, the Graduate Certificate in Strategic Enrollment Management. So on the slide here, you can see that we are not too far away from our intake starting August 16th, 2021, putting the application deadline at May 16th, 2021. If you're looking a little further out, we do have our 2022 start date posted as well. So that puts us to August 15th, 2022, with the application deadline of May 15th, 2022. So if you have any questions about the program, this is a great time to start popping them in the chat box. And between myself, Tamara, Clayton, and Lisa, we are more than happy to answer those now, or again, connect offline as well. So here, we wanted to provide a quick overview of some of the other programs we have in our suite of higher education, administrative, and leadership. So you may have heard us say the acronym HEAL, or MHEAL rather. When we say that, we're talking about our Master of Arts in Higher Education and Administration and Leadership. Within that program, we have some how would you say, opportunities to dip your toes, to get started with perhaps a graduate certificate or a graduate diploma. If you're looking at this area as a way to explore higher education leadership, but you're thinking, okay, maybe an MA isn't quite where I can fit right now. So if you're looking at something, so of course our MA is a 2-year program, but we have our graduate diploma. The graduate diploma in higher education administration and leadership is year 1 of our MA program. That's a wonderful place to start and get a feel for how learning right now can work for you. And within our program, we do have some specialization streams as well. So our graduate certificate in business development and international education, as well as our graduate certificate in systems leadership. And they follow a very similar format that we just heard about for our graduate certificate in strategic enrollment management. Looking at our chat box real quick, I see Lisa has popped some links about these programs here as well. And we had a question around cost. So Lisa has provided a link where you can check out the payment schedules for any of these programs here and learn about how they move together. Speaking of Lisa, here's her contact info. So if you'd like to connect with Lisa and any of her team, you can find them at learn.more@railroads.ca. And if you're joining us internationally, our international admissions and registration team is more than happy to chat. And you can find them at learn.more.international@railroads.ca. So looking at the chat box one more time, thank you so much for popping this in, Lisa. So Lisa has said that we encourage applicants to chat with our amazing alumni who can share their RU experience and how they're applying their learning. So if you'd like to connect with alumni from our Maheel program or any of the specializations, please connect with Lisa directly at lisa.murray@railroads.ca, and she'd be more than happy to set up those conversations. So with that, we have come to a close on the formal presentation portion of our session today. If you have any questions about systems thinking, strategic enrollment management, or any of the programs that we talked about, feel free to pop them in the chat box. Recognizing while we did a very light dive into these topics, it was a lot of information nonetheless. So things will be bubbling after the session, I'm sure. So please connect with us offline, and we're more than happy to continue the conversation on any of these topics with all of you. So with that, I will extend a big thank you for everyone who joined us and for all those who registered and are watching the recording now. We wish you a great rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on when and where you're watching this from. Bye-bye, everyone.